Welcome everybody to another book to game comparison video for the Nancy Drew series. Today I'm going to be looking at Trail of the Twister. I will start by talking about the novel. This is The Mystery in Tornado Alley and was published in the year 2000. And then I'm going to look at the game, which is Trail of the Twister and was released 10 years after the book in 2010. Naturally, a spoiler alert is in effect because I will be saying who the culprits are for both stories and so much more. So with that, let's look at the book. So this is book number 155, The Mystery in Tornado Alley. It's part of the Nancy Drew Mystery Stories series. So Hannah Gruen inherits a farm from her cousin Bertha, and it happens to be located in Oklahoma. She's thinking about selling the property, so she, along with the Drews and Nancy's best friends, Bess and George, decide to drive out to that state to take a look at the property before Hannah makes up her mind. And on their way there, they get caught on the edge of a tornado. So what a welcome to Tornado Alley. They get to deal firsthand with one as soon as they enter the state. So luckily they are at the edge of it and nothing too serious happens. Their vehicle's a little bit damaged and they all had to get out and hide in a ditch because that was the safest place to be. And from there they then enter Medicine Bluff. That's where the farm is located. And fortunately the house is left intact. There's some damage to some of the buildings on the property, but the house is okay. And while they're doing some tidying up, they find a duffel bag caught up in a tree. And Nancy digs out a ladder, goes up into the tree, and takes the duffel bag. And inside she finds ransom notes. So quite quickly they figure there is probably going to be a kidnapping if it hasn't already happened. And they're trying to figure out who is being kidnapped, who's written these notes, when's it going to happen if it hasn't already, and so they figure that it might be worth going to this tornado laboratory in the city that's associated with the university to try and figure out where the bag may have come from and how it wound up in the tree. So they're implementing some science, and it's a great opportunity to learn about winds and the power of a tornado and how great of a distance something can travel. And she encounters a couple different characters. There's someone who comes to the property after she finds the bag who insists it's his, and also says that the house belongs to him, that Bertha was going to leave it to him. So we've got not necessarily some competition, but some uncertainty as to the ownership of the farm. So they're dealing with that along with this potential kidnapping. And the police don't believe Nancy. They suspect it's probably a prank. And she has a hard time trying to figure out in this community of strangers who could be behind this plot. So some of the characters we encounter are Jimmy Boyd. So he's a young gentleman who was in the army, and he's the one who comes by Bertha's property and is looking for some of his possessions in her farmhouse, or rather in the barn, and says that he expected to inherit her house. We then have Mary Harvey, who we presume to be Jimmy's girlfriend, and she helps him with trying to reclaim this duffel bag that they say belongs to him. We have Derek Owens, who is a former student at the university and has been studying tornadoes, and his dad used to be the director of the tornado laboratory until his passing. And then we have Candace and Dr. Johnson. So Candace is a student, and her dad, Dr. Johnson, is the new director of the tornado lab. So through all of these adventures dealing with the house and farm and trying to track down a kidnapper, what we learn is that Jimmy did believe that, based on letters that Bertha had written to him, that he was going to inherit the house. This was a genuine belief of his, and he thinks the Drews and Hannah are trying to take the house from him. Despite all this, he's not the one who's plotting anything nefarious. It's actually Derek, the student at the university. There is a bit of a grudge, you could say, that he has, partly because his dad used to be director, but Dr. Johnson doesn't listen to his ideas about studying tornadoes, and so he seeks revenge, and he had planned to kidnap Candace and to request a ransom from her dad. But in the end, of course, Nancy figured out it was him, and he kidnaps Nancy, and the two enter a tornado. So things get pretty intense. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the ending. But that's the essence of the book, and it, to me, doesn't sound like it flows very well, but there you have it. So this group of people have gone down to figure out whether or not this property is worth keeping or selling, and they kind of uncover a plot to kidnap and it's associated with tornadoes there in Tornado Alley. So now let's look at the game. So this is Trail of the Twister. It's game number 22 of the Nancy Drew Mystery Adventure series. And Nancy's hired by P.G. Krollmeister to investigate sabotage that a storm chasing team has been experiencing in Oklahoma. So Nancy's role is basically that of a gopher. She's fixing down broken and damaged equipment for the team and running errands, creating disaster kits, recreating a siren chart to make sure that when a tornado warning is announced that the whole community is covered and will be aware of this. And some other menial chores. I mean, she moves groundhogs and things like that around that don't necessarily have anything to do with tornado research. So she's sort of a jack of all trades in this game. And at one point, she's out driving, and the GPS system that she's using sends her directly into the path of a storm. And there's a question of whether or not this was just a faulty system, or was it sabotaged and meant to send her into a dangerous situation. So all this is unfolding as Nancy's trying to figure out who's responsible for what clearly appears to be sabotage. So the suspects in the game include Scott Varnell. So he's basically the head of this storm chasing team for Canute College. We have Debbie Kirkham, who's been on his team for like 4 years or so, and she's the manager. She's the one who gives everyone their instructions. Then we have Frosty, or Tobias Harlow. Frosty is his nickname, who is basically a videographer and photographer for the team. And then we have Chase Rellerford, who is a fairly new team member and does a lot of what Nancy does. He's doing a lot of maintenance. He's been fixing cars. And then we have Pa Oaks, or Ox. I'm not sure how he has his last name pronounced. It can be both. But he runs a general store in town and is essentially point of contact for the team. And he has sort of a tragic history involving tornadoes. So as we play through the game, what we learned is that Scott, with the help of a woman named Brooke Tavenagh, and she is the leader for a competing storm chasing team, they together have been sabotaging the Canute team. And Scott does this as an act of revenge. And I'll talk a little bit more about that revenge when I go over characters. But there we go, that is this game. So it's really focused primarily on tornadoes themselves, with Nancy fixing a lot of things and running around. So there's our game. So now let's start comparing. So the first thing to look at, as has become the norm, are the titles between the two stories, because they do differ. So the source material, which is the book, is called The Mystery in Tornado Alley. Her Interactive changed the title for the game. It is Trail of the Twister. And they're both suitable titles for both stories. I'm not sure why Her Interactive changed the title. Maybe they just liked the alliteration and the way that sort of rolls off the tongue, Trail of the Twister, whereas The Mystery in Tornado Alley is a bit more wordy, so perhaps that's why. But otherwise, there's not really a big difference in terms of what the title relays. It's the same, essentially. Our storylines are different. So for the book, Nancy uncovers a kidnapping plot while they're in Tornado Alley. So that's what she's focused on in the book, whereas in the game, she's investigating a string of sabotage perpetrated against a storm chasing team. So two very different storylines. Our locations are basically the same. They're both set in Oklahoma. In the game we have, or rather in the book, we have a town name, which is Medicine Bluff. In the game, we don't necessarily have a name for the town, but it's in Cato County. I'm not sure again how that's pronounced, and we learned that by looking at a newspaper in Pa's general store. So, but yeah, both are set in Oklahoma, and I should also add that they're both in Tornado Alley, which makes a whole lot of sense given sort of where the stories are going. So now let's look at our characters. So like I've had to do quite a lot, there's not a lot of overlap between characters. So I'm going to start by looking at the characters who were first in the book and then those in the game. And there's only one character really who we kind of see in both stories. So I'll start with Jimmy from the book. So he's a young army vet, and he was working for Bertha when he was discharged, and he'd expected the house to be left to him, and this was because of letters that the two had written to one another, and she had implied that the house would be his upon her passing. But he suspects that Hannah and the Drews are trying to unlawfully take it for themselves. And these letters that he'd kept from Bertha were kept in a green duffel bag. So when he sees that Nancy's found this duffel bag, he wants it because that's where he kept these letters, which should be proof that he's the lawful owner of that house. But of course, there are no letters in the bag. Nancy found ransom notes instead. So there's some difficulty there. He's trying to prove his case, whereas the Drews and Hannah don't really know what to make of his story because there is no proof, at least not until the very end. Then we have Mary. She's also only in the book, and she tries to help out Jimmy by reclaiming the missing letters from Bertha. She approaches Nancy, and without her knowing that the two are associated, Mary and Jimmy, she says that the bag is hers and wants to come off as all sweet and hopes that Nancy will then give it to her. But Nancy doesn't, because the bag actually winds up being taken from Nancy. And the other thing about Mary is she's a half-sister to Candace Johnson, who I'll talk about now. So again, another character who's only in the book, and she's a university student. And Derek, who we'll get to next, he shows some interest in her, and she's also the daughter of the Tornado Laboratory director. So she's a very minor role within the book. So now we'll look at the last character from the book. This is Derek, and there's overlap between him and Scott from the game. So they are both the culprits, the two stories. In the book, Derek is a former student. Again, his dad used to be the director of the Tornado Laboratory, and then he recently passed away. And Derek's frustrated with Dr. Johnson, again, that's the new director, because he won't listen to his theories about how to best research tornadoes. And Derek says that he can feel things. He can feel the change in atmospheric pressure, so he knows sort of where to go and how to predict where a tornado is going to land. And he is also a photographer. He really loves taking photos of the storms and tornadoes. And with all this, he then intends to kidnap Dr. Johnson's daughter, Candace. He thinks this is how he's going to get his way, and he's going to ask for a ransom from Dr. Johnson. And then he's going to get some high-tech tornado chasing gear and move out of state and prove that he knows what he's talking about. But he comes to a rather sad end, which we'll talk about a bit later. The game, it's a little bit different, although Scott is still associated with the university. So rather than being a former student, he's actually the lead for the Canute College storm chasing team. So he's still fairly well affiliated with the university. But he sort of begrudges the university because they are denying him tenure. So he partners with his competition to sabotage his own team out of revenge. So two rather bitter individuals who seem to be trusted people and in the end really are not. So there's our one character where we've got some overlap. Next we'll look at the game-only characters, and I'll start with Debbie. So again, she's the manager for Scott's team, even though he's the lead. She's the one who gives out the directives, and she keeps the team on task. With that said, she actually tries to oust Scott from the team, and she has Frosty helping her with her plans. She also volunteers at the Grange Theatre, so she's very busy. She's got a lot on her hands and a lot on her plate. Very busy lady. Then we can look at Frosty. So again, he was sort of helping Debbie out with her plan of removing Scott from the team. He's also the photographer and videographer for the storm chasing team. And he sells some of his footage to help out an aspiring artist who's trying to get their foot in the door in the industry. So he's not completely honest himself, but he's trying to be helpful for someone else. It's not necessarily that he's trying to damage his team. He's just doing sort of the wrong thing to help someone out. And we could say there's some overlap between him and Derek as well, simply because of the photography interests that the two characters share. But beyond that, he's sort of his own character for the game. And then we've got Chase, another game-only character. He does the mechanical work for the team, and he's fairly new to the Canute team. And he's also secretly scouting for oil wells in the vicinity, sort of a get-rich-quick scheme that he has. And then our last character is Paw. So he runs the local store, and as noted earlier, he's a point of contact for the storm chasers. And he's experienced first-hand loss at the hand of a twister. His wife, Betsy, best known as Ma, was killed in a tornado. So, sort of a sad story for him and the history he has with tornadoes. So those are our characters as individuals, and then I just want to make note of some other similarities we have between the two versions of the story, and sort of sticking with the character theme is storm chasers, because we have those in both the book and the game. And basically they seek to gather information that is going to help with research and better understanding and hopefully predicting tornadoes in a given area. So very interesting profession that we learn about between these two stories. And then I have to make note of the F and EF scales. So this is a scale used to measure the intensity of damage done by a twister, and it's looking at the winds and wind speed. So the F scale is the original measure, and it was created by Dr. T. Theodore Fujita. And the EF scale is just an enhanced version of that. And where the F scale just looks at winds, the EF scale also looks into the material of a building. That's taken into consideration for how to rate damage. And the novel makes mention of the F scale only, and this is because it was published in the year 2000. The EF scale wasn't created until 7 years after the book was released. So there was no concept of an EF scale back then. And then the game, of course, talks about both. It discusses the original scale and then the difference with the EF scale. So an important thing to be aware of when you're dealing with twisters. And then the last thing to go over are the endings. So there are some similarities between the endings. So start with the book, and Nancy basically deduces that Derek is our real culprit, the one who's planning this kidnapping plot. It had looked like it was Jimmy and Mary, and that maybe they were going to kidnap Candace, for instance, because Nancy saw the two drive over to her house, but noticed that, they seemed not to be arguing. Things were actually pretty good, and Nancy later learns that the two girls are half-sisters. But she still suspected that Jimmy might have been planning some sort of kidnapping, maybe not of Candace. But Nancy sort of secretly reasons that it's actually Derek who's behind it all. And then he realizes that she knows the truth. And the two are driving together, and he decides to drive them out toward a tornado that has come into the town. And the intent he has is to put Nancy's life in danger and essentially for her to be killed by this tornado. And he plans to get away and still commit the kidnapping of Candace to get the ransom from her dad. And as already stated, the idea is to then take that ransom money so he can buy his own equipment and do the research that he thinks is the right way to study tornadoes. Alas for him, his plan doesn't come to pass. It's really the reverse. He loses his life in the tornado. Nancy does not. Their car gets pulled into the funnel, and I think that would be absolutely terrifying, and Derek gets knocked unconscious. Nancy manages to hold on to the steering wheel, and she does get flapped around a little bit, but she's able to drop herself out of the car, which, depending on how high up she could have also killed her, but she figured that was a better likelihood of survival than staying in the car. And the tornado then takes the car with it after she's on the ground, and she's able to hold on and not get swept back up into it. So it ends quite tragically for Derek. So very, very sad ending, and a bit more heavy than the game. So if we look at the game, we've got a twister that's come through, and Nancy, among many others, go to the Grange Theater to seek some shelter. And then the worst of the tornado passes, and Nancy has to go find Scott because he's still out there. And she's figured out that he's the one responsible for the sabotage. And she figured that out before getting to the Grange Theater. And once she finds Scott, he actually winds up having an accident of his own. He has a crash, and she has to pull him into a little spring house, and they seek shelter for her a second time, seeking shelter from the storm. And once that passes, the police come, and Scott is arrested. So very different endings as far as mortality and survival rate. And Poor Nancy having to deal with tornadoes in both stories. So those are our endings. So with that, I will conclude. So the 2002 novel and the 2010, the 2000, not 2002, the 2000 novel and the 2010 Her Interactive Computer Game adaptation do have some similarities, and primarily the tornado theme. Obviously, because they're in Tornado Alley and they they come up, and the fact that there's a farmhouse, Nancy's staying at one in both stories, and storm chasing teams being involved, and not only being involved but being associated with a university or post-secondary institution. But that's sort of where the similarities end. The book focuses on a kidnapping plot, which we don't see whatsoever in the game. The game is about sabotage surrounding Twister research and this Green Skies competition. And I haven't talked about the competition because it doesn't really, it does matter, but it doesn't have a major role in our story in some respects. The characters don't really overlap between the two stories, with sort of an exception of the culprits to an extent. So there are some similarities between Derek and Scott, but otherwise the plots, characters, and events of the two stories are completely different. So it's a curious direction that Her Interactive took, deviating so much from the book, but in some ways creating a greater focus on what you'd expect the content to be, and that's that of tornadoes. So there we go. That ends my book to game comparison video for the Mystery in Tornado Alley and Trail of the Twister. So interesting stories, I guess. I mean, it's a great learning opportunity. However, it's not anything I wanted to learn. So I didn't really care for the book or the game. They just don't interest me at all. The book, it is interesting that it was focused more on kidnapping. It was basically a kidnapping story with an element of tornadoes and that type of weather, whereas the game really was quite a bit more about tornadoes, with Nancy running around doing random and rather tiresome activities. I do think that there could have been things done differently in the game to make it more interesting, like changing the types of tasks, although I don't know what they could have been to be more tornado focused. One thing they could have included, I think was sort of a missed opportunity, was a tornado lab, which is in the book. That's how Nancy meets Derek and learns about Dr. Johnson. Having this research facility, so seeing a little bit more of it would have been really neat, I think. But that's pretty much it. Again, this just isn't a story that was at all interesting to me, so I have sort of a hard time talking about this one just because I don't really care. So I'll leave it at that, you guys. Thank you for watching this book to game comparison video, and I look forward to doing the next one, which will be for Shadow at the Water's Edge. Thanks so much. Bye bye.